welcome to class. We will go ahead and get started today with our lecture. Take your books and turn to page number 445, chapter 17. 445, chapter 17. I just want to warn you guys that it is very early in the morning, and I have done things early in the morning before. I have done these lectures early in the morning before, but I've never been this tired. And I am pretty tired right now. And, I find that when I'm tired, I end up becoming more goofy. So I think you guys are going to enjoy class tonight because I am very, very tired. And so fully expect goofiness to abound. So what we finished off talking about last lesson, we talked about out of chapter 16, the Romantic Age. The Romantic Age was a reaction against the Age of Reason, and as we often talk with history, usually what happens is the pendulums shift. And as drastic as it can be one generation, just hang around a little bit because it's going to swing back the other way. The Age of Reason was a great philosophical age. They pondered the purposes of God and the purposes of government and man's response to evil and man's response to God. And then the Age of Romanticism came in, and not all of the Romantics, but much of the Romanticism that took place during that time was focused on reacting against the Word of God and the reality of biblical Christianity. We talked about Percy Shelley, who was very anti-religion, and his view on life was very, very distorted because of it. Now, as we go from the intelligence of the Enlightenment to I'm not saying that the Romantic Age wasn't an intelligent age. The things that were written and the things that were painted were beautiful, and that requires intelligence. But remember what we talked about, the Romantic Age moved it out of the mind and moved it to the heart. It always based on, what do you feel? I think, therefore I am. I feel as though I am. So the Romantics kind of made it look like if you felt something was true, then that was the truth that you needed to seek. And by the way, we see a lot of that today in our own reality. Oprah Winfrey several years ago talked about your truth, meaning everybody has their own truth. Well, that's a very romantic type ideal, and it's very, very opposite of the Bible. So the Romantic Age really kind of enveloped that thinking. And now we are going into a new age. This is the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution is viewed its greatest through a novel. It's not through a history book. It's viewed through a certain novel that was written. And you see the opening portion of that novel on page number 445. You probably have never read this book before. I know I have never read this book before. But even those of us that have never read this book before, we know the opening lines to this book. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, and was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. These lines are the opening lines to Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities. These two cities aptly describe the European society in the second half of the 19th century. The eyes of many Europeans of this period was the best of times. Nationalism and democratic liberalism were bringing about great changes. We talked about all of the changes. Italy was unifying. Germany was unifying. A lot of the ideals of the Enlightenment were beginning to take shape. That is a great positive. That's part of the best of times that Charles Dickens is talking about. However, on the other side, there was a lot of negatives that took place, the worst of times. The second half of the 19th century, this portion that Dickens is referring to is called the Industrial Revolution. And The Industrial Revolution, let no man tell you that the Industrial Revolution was nothing but evil. The Industrial Revolution had the greatest effect on world history than probably anything else. The Industrial Revolution allows you to wear the clothes on your back. It allows you in many cases to have the phone that you have in your hand or the laptop that you're using to watch this video. Much of what we have today would not have been possible if not for the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution caused a lot of great things. The Industrial Revolution has a lot to say about man's individuality, about man's capacity to surmount a challenge, the capacity of human beings to increase in their ingenuity and their imagination. And we'll discuss this in depth today, but just take my word for it. These are some great times that are brought about the Industrial Revolution. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the Industrial Revolution was nothing but evil. However, there were also negative points to the Industrial Revolution. And the negative portions of the Industrial Revolution were largely due to the living conditions and the working conditions. This is what a lot of the left and a lot of the world they'll look at the Industrial Revolution. And absolutely, the Industrial Revolution had horrible living conditions. People were basically working in factories for little to nothing. And there was a lot of cronyism that was going on, and it was not the best of times for them. But thankfully, people of morality, people of Christian faith, and some that are not of Christian faith, but still people that had a sense of a moral type that was mentioned in the Bible, even though they might not subscribe to biblical Christianity, they at least agree on some basic truths. And that basic truth is this: the workman is worthy of his hire. That's a biblical truth. So while the left will tell you, man, the Industrial Revolution was a horrible time because big business kept people in bondage. They paid them pennies a day or nickels a day or dimes a day. All of that stuff is partially true, but at the same time, guess what? Biblical Christians, as well as people that weren't biblical Christians, but still subscribe to a biblical framework, the biblical framework of you shall be worthy of your hire, was still amongst everybody's mind. And a lot of the reforms that would take place towards the end of the Industrial Revolution, not justified, that's not a good way to put it, but it kind of cleansed a lot of the negatives. They made up for it, is what I'm trying to say. The Industrial Revolution, you need to know, it starts in Britain. And you need to know that poor working conditions characterized much of the Industrial Revolution. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, why do we call it the Industrial Revolution? Because the modern factory system came into existence. Now, we will learn what the modern factory system is in a few moments. But what the modern factory system essentially does is it is a way of conducting business that maximizes output while maximizing efficiency. Maximizing efficiency as well as output. Write that down, if for no other reason, so you can understand when we get to the end, you can look back at the beginning and say, okay, I see what Mr. Seaford was telling me about. Maximizing, I'm going to write this down myself so that way I don't forget, because that just came off the top of my head. Maximizing, what did I say? Maximizing output, maximizing efficiency. We'll discuss that further as we get towards the end of the lecture today. So you should have this all written down, and if you don't, well, then there's no help for you because we've stayed here for quite a while. Anyway, before the Industrial Revolution took place, there were some conditions that kind of sowed the fields. You know, when someone goes to farm and they plant beans, they've got some prep work that they have to go through first in order for those beans to actually grow. First thing they have to do is they have to plow. They have to till the ground. They can't just drop seeds in the ground and hope for a fruitful harvest. They've got to go with the equipment. I'm not a farmer, so I'm not going to even attempt to guess what equipment that would be. I'm not sure if it would be a combine or just a tilling machine. They would go up with a tilling machine, and they will till up the ground, stir up the ground. By the way, that's what the Bible calls breaking up fallow ground. The book of Hosea, I believe, talks about breaking up the fallow ground. They break up the ground so that way it can prepare for a fruitful harvest. Just like that, the Industrial Revolution could not have started without some prep work. And some of the prep work, the factors that made the Industrial Revolution possible, number one, they had an adequate food supply. So, the Industrial Revolution was preceded, meaning the thing that went before it, by a revolution in agriculture. New machines and better methods of farming led to an increase of food supply and was able to meet the demands of the growing urban population. So you wouldn't have had the Industrial Revolution without this revolution in food supply. The second factor was a large and mobile labor force. Gone are the days of feudalism where people were pretty much tied to their feudal land grant, and very few people ever moved within 5 or 10 miles outside that land grant. This is a large and mobile labor force, and they were able to move from one town to the other pretty quickly. And guess what? This allowed for when the Industrial Revolution did take place, it allowed people to move from one place to another place fairly quickly. The last factor was the expansion of trade. The expansion of trade caused the industrial age to really become fruitful. These are the three factors that tilled the ground, broke up the fallow ground, and prepared the way for the great successes of the Industrial Revolution. Now, let's look at some of these one at a time individual. What caused that adequate food supply? What allowed for that food supply to grow so much? Well, you had different inventions that were made. The first invention was made by Jethro Hull. Jethro Hull was a farmer, and he invented the seed drill, otherwise known as, it's just a planting machine. This seed drill, which is basically a planting machine, it did away with the wasteful scattering of seed. When the Bible talks about Jesus, when Jesus said, "Behold, the sower went forth to sow," what that means is the farmer would go out with a bag of seed, and he would reach his hand in that bag of seed and basically throw the seed as he went. It did not matter where he was going, he just threw it everywhere. That's not an effective way of farming. What Jethro Hull did was he invented a seed drill or a planter that allowed them to plant in maximize, again, the phrase maximizing output by maximizing efficiency. If you're just throwing seed everywhere, guess what? You are wasting a lot of seed and you're wasting a lot of money. And you're not going to maximize the amount of fruit you're growing. So Jethro Hull figured out you can not waste so much money on seed, making what seed you have go further by creating a machine that allows for these seeds to be planted in a straight row, and they'd be spaced apart correctly, and they'd be able to create productivity. The next guy, Robert Bakewell, he developed selective breeding. Now, This selective breeding produced larger and healthier farm animals. So, if for those of you that remember Pastor Wagner, what he did, he had when he was pastor there, he had a dog breeding business. I worked with him my senior year, and my first year in college. I worked maybe even second year in college for about 2 or 3 years. I worked for him at his dog breeding business, and he started out doing breeding just golden retrievers. And then eventually he branched out and he bred golden retrievers mixed with poodles. And you got golden doodles. So basically you have the body of a golden retriever with the hair of a poodle, and that's very desirable. Excuse me. That's selective breeding. You were able to breed in certain positive characteristics, and eventually you will also breed out negative attributes, which, let's face it, poodles, they're all negative attributes. Sorry for any poodle lovers we have in here. But so what Robert Bakewell decided is, listen, I've got a horse that has this positive trait and this other animal with a positive factor. I can breed them and create maybe a hybrid of positive genes, and maybe over several generations I can breed out negative genes, and that will create for a larger and healthier farm animal. That really affected this agricultural revolution that preceded the Industrial Revolution. Then you had Charles Townshend. He created a method called crop rotation. Now, when I say he created it, he really didn't create it. Maybe he popularized it in the modern world. But I got news for you. Crop rotation is a biblical trait. If lest you doubt me, go to Exodus 23:10. Exodus 23:10, and I want you to read that along with me, but I also want you to look it up for yourself in the Bible. So go ahead, pause the video if you have to, grab your Bible, and go to that reference, Exodus 23:10. All right, I'm going to assume you had that all done. So, Exodus 23:10. This is a law that God gave the people of Israel. Exodus 23:10, and 6 years shalt thou sow thy land, and shalt gather in the fruits thereof, and in the 7th year thou shalt let it rest and lie still, that the poor of thy people may eat, and when they leave the beasts of the field shall eat. In like manner shalt thou do with thy vineyard, and with thy olive yard. 6 days thou shalt do thy work, and on the 7th day thou shalt rest, and thine ox and thine ass may rest, and the son of thy handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. Okay, so, according to this law, for 6 years, the people of Judah were required, after the 6th year and going into the 7th year, they were required to let that field rest. They weren't supposed to produce anything on that land. Why? That 7th year would be the way the land could recoup from having produced so much fruit over 6 years. And so it was supposed to rejuvenate the earth. The Lord always gave the people of Israel an insight that science wouldn't provide the people of the world with for hundreds of years. What the people of the world did not know when God gave this law to the Israelites, they didn't realize that if you continue to plant on the same field so many years, eventually that land will stop providing bountiful fruit, because you have pretty much drained that land of any nutrients. And the 7th year, God said, okay, Israel, you don't understand what's going on. Just take my word for it. Every 7th year, you guys need to let that land rest. And elsewhere in the Bible, and I don't have the reference with me, elsewhere in the Bible says that God required the children of Israel to to plant other types of fruit in a field. That would also allow for the rest and rejuvenation of the earth. That's what crop rotation does. You go to a modern farmer and you ask them, what's crop rotation? It's a form of that original law. The original law that said, seventh year you shall let it rest. What what Charles Townshend realizes is, listen, I need to let the land rest. But rather than just not letting the land rest for a year, he decided, listen, we can produce, let's just say corn in a field for 6 years. And then the 7th year we'll produce beans or something. That will allow the ground to rejuvenate and restore the nutrients in the earth, and you will get a better bounty with that next harvest. Finally, a new type of land laws that were going on is the enclosure movement. This was passed by Parliament. The enclosure movement basically allowed common pastures, which were pastures that pretty much anybody could use. It's basically communism. Not really, but kind of. It allowed pretty much anybody. It was a pasture that anybody could go into, and that they could plant their own food there. It's not a good system. And Parliament said, listen, we can't allow this, so we're going to allow landowners to buy these common pastures, and that way they can form larger farms because these farms are supposed to help the country at large. So, after you get into the agricultural revolution that paved the way for the Industrial Revolution, then you have the textile industry. Now, the question, what in the world does this meme have to do with the textile industry? Answer, nothing. But I could not find any meme that had anything to do with the textile revolution, and this is just plain funny. And so I'm like, I'm not going to let them at least not have a laugh. We are all for fat-shaming fake Disney characters. So, anyway, I told you guys, when I get tired, I get goofy. Okay, textile industry. The Industrial Revolution made its breakthrough with the cotton industry. Now, this would end up causing part of the reason behind the Civil War. So, I don't want to get ahead of myself. The Industrial Revolution started out in Britain, but it would eventually make its way to America. And in America, the northern states became industrialized. The Industrial Revolution hit the North first. In the South did not industrialize until after Reconstruction. They were mostly agrarian. Now, why does that matter? Well, that matters here because of this reason. The South, they were committed to textiles and an agrarian society, meaning the South was all about farming food and farming cotton. And cotton was used in making clothes. What would happen is in the South, the Southerners would grow cotton. Then they'd ship that cotton off up north or overseas to England, and they would use that cotton to make clothes. Now, something that a lot of people don't realize is this. Before, what was that date here? Before 1793. Before 1793, the cotton exports began to go down. The South began to kind of stop their agrarian system. But then, the textile industry picked up just before the American Civil War due to a new invention that let the textile industry take off. I don't want to spoil the end here, so I'm not going to go any further than that until we start off here with this slide. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But I live in Alexander County. Alexander County, if you're unaware, that's the county in which Taylorsville is the county seat. And Alexander County is nothing but textile, basically. I literally, as I'm sitting here in my bedroom recording this, about the length of a football field from my bedroom to the back fence of my yard. On the other side of that fence is a railroad. On the other side of that railroad is Craftmaster Furniture. Craftmaster Furniture is right behind my house, less than a football field's length away from my bedroom. If you go down the road closer towards Taylorsville, you will run into another Craftmaster Furniture company. Same company, but different factory. You go down the road even further, you get to Mitchell Gold, which is a furniture factory built by that's owned by two gay men. There used to be a Broyhill furniture company in town. Alexander County is nothing but textile for years. So this is something that kind of hits home for me, for an Alexander County citizen, because the textiles has pretty much been the lifeblood of Alexander County economy for years. But I get ahead of myself. The textile industry, improvements that were made leading up to the Industrial Revolution. One of the things is John Kay invented what's called the flying shuttle. Now, a shuttle is a wood beam that's used on a weaver's guild, and it is used in creating clothes. By the way, the Bible refers to a weaver's beam. In the King James, it's weaver's beam. I use the King James. That's the one I believe is the most accurate English translation. There are other translations, though, that use the word a weaver's shuttle. Now, I believe weaver's beam is the most accurate. I believe you can get the best look at what you're talking about. You can understand a weaver's beam easier than a shuttle, in my view. But regardless, a shuttle is that beam that's used in the weaving process. The Bible talks about Goliath, his staff, his spear being about the size of a weaver's beam. This is a big piece of wood that's used in the textile industry. This invention made it possible for a weaver to work faster and to weave cloth for greater width. Again, the weaver's beam it's talking about in the Bible is obviously not this one, because this is in 1733 when the flying shuttle is created. It's a much earlier primitive version of John Kay's invention. This invention made it possible for the weaver to work faster and to weave cloth of greater width. One weaver, however, now needed 4 spinners to keep him supplied with thread. So if you look at go back, if you own a copy of the movie Courageous, Javier, when he gets that new job at that textile mill, he's asked by his bosses to do some shady stuff that's very dishonest, and he toils over that. And then he comes to the conclusion that he can't do it. It would dishonor his God. And so he goes in the next day and says, I'm sorry, but if that's what it takes to be a team player, then I'm not a team player. I'm not going to do what you ask him to. Then they promote him for being willing to stand up against what they're asking him to do, which is dishonest. And they give him a promotion, and they tell him he starts on Friday. He walks back out, calls his wife, and then gets back on the line in the textile mill. You will notice as he goes back, he's smiling, he's happy. He starts taking these giant spindles of yarn or of some type of textile. He puts it on a spindle and starts running the length of cord into the machine. That is what one of these this is what one of these spindles is. Now, James Hargreaves, he solved a problem that John Kay's flying shuttle caused. John Kay's flying shuttle made it possible for a weaver to weave faster, but he ran out of cloth on this, or on yeah, he ran out of cloth on the spinner faster. So what he would do is he created a way called the spinning jenny that would allow more and more thread to be put into the process. And you can see modern versions of this in Courageous. As you watch that, he sticks the guys, I'm really tired and this is beginning to affect me now. He throws the thread on the machine and starts running it through the machine. That's basically what this is, only a modern version of it. This allowed for the spinning of up to 8 threads at once. So what he would do is he'd take these small pieces of cords, and using the spinning jenny, it would weave 8 threads at a time to create string, and that string would go into the weaving process of creating blankets and coats and pants and things like that. All right. Also in the textile industry, you had a guy by the name of Richard Arkwright. He invented the spinning frame that not only produced thread, that's supposed to be thread, not threat, not only produced thread superior to the spinning jenny, but was also powered by water. So Richard Arkwright's invention topped the spinning jenny created by James Hargreaves. And it was a whole lot better because it was powered by water. And water is an 100% renewable energy. You never, as long as it's self-contained, as long as it's contained, you can use it over and over again. You don't have to replace it. Unless, of course, there's a leak somewhere. He is also known as the father of the Industrial Revolution. Then you've got a guy by the name of Samuel Crompton. He created a spinning machine that threaded 1,000 threads at a time. That's getting more in line to what Javier had in his scene in that movie. You're looking at more of something like that. Now, this is where we're getting down to where the rubber meets the road. This is where it all comes full circle. All right, Eli Whitney. In 1793, Eli Whitney devised what's called the cotton gin. The cotton gin allowed for the spinning, weaving, and preparation of raw cotton. So up till this point in history, slaves were being used to pick cotton. And Eli Whitney was an anti-slavery guy. He was an abolitionist. He didn't want slavery to continue. And in his mind, if he could create a way to make slavery obsolete, then he might just contribute to the destruction of slavery altogether. So he creates the cotton gin. And the idea was you don't need slaves anymore. You can hire people, and you can hire fewer people and have them at these cotton gins, and they could spin it, weave it, and prepare the raw cotton at a much more efficient. Once again, the battle cry of the Industrial Revolution is maximizing output and maximizing efficiency. If he could make it more efficient to use the cotton gins rather than slaves to do their work, while at the same time maximizing output, then that would be a way that slavery would eventually die out. The problem is that's not the way it worked. It was a very, very well-intentioned plan by Mr. Whitney, but all that did was create more slaves to use these cotton gins. All it did was create more problems for the slaves, because now the slaveholders wanted to keep the slaves to run these cotton gins. And this is why I said it earlier, the cotton industry was on a steady decline before 1793. Before the cotton gin was created, the rates of cotton production and sales were actually going down. But now the South had a reason to continue using their land for agrarian purposes. Why would they need to industrialize like the North was? They said it'd make a whole lot more sense to let the North industrialize, and we'll keep to our agrarian ways, and we'll use our slaves, and we'll use our cotton gins, and we'll create all of this cotton the world needs, and that's how we'll stay powerful. That's why after the Civil War, the Southern economy hit zero. The Southern economy collapsed. People like to say, well, it was because they ended slavery that the Southern economy collapsed. Not really. Really, the reason the Southern economy collapsed was because the Union came down south and destroyed the infrastructure of the South. They destroyed the farms. They destroyed the warehouses. They destroyed the abilities of the Southerners to continue in this agrarian society. And so they just laid pretty much economically destitute for anywhere from 50 to 100 years. It wasn't until really 70s and 80s that the South began to, well, 70s and 80s, that's probably a little bit too soon, but it wasn't until much later where they began to industrialize. And when the South became less agrarian and became more industrialized, that's why the South is so profitable now. You've got Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia is the Hollywood of the East. You've got Florida, one of the entertainment capitals in the country, with Disneyland, Disney World. You've got all of these benefits in the South now because the South decided to industrialize. But this came on the heels of them having for years and generations used Eli Whitney's and Samuel Crompton's and Richard Arkwright's agrarian principles. Now, again, this picture has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I thought it was funny, so I threw it in here. Okay. I have lost my place here. Okay, the factory system. In the earliest stages of the Industrial Revolution, there were no factories in the modern sense of the word. Workers lived in rural areas. They labored at home using their own hand tools. For the most part, they were able to set their own work schedules and determine how much they wanted to produce. But the size and expense of the new industrial machinery made it impossible for this domestic system to continue. So no longer could these factory workers work from home like they had grown accustomed to. It wasn't efficient. Once again, Industrial Revolution, the battle cry was maximizing output. Let's put out as much of our product as we can while doing it as efficiently as possible. Now, they then got rid of this domestic system and created the factory system. Now, the factory system brought the workers, the raw materials, and the machinery all under one roof. So that way they wouldn't have to go and find out, okay, who do we go to get this part? Who do we go to get this part? No, it's all under one roof. This is the modern factory system that, by the way, is still used today. Now, the development of industrialism. Now, really, we're getting into the meat and the potatoes of industrialization. Again, we're talking mostly about the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in England. It would eventually move over into the United States with this guy in the picture, Andrew Carnegie. He was pretty much the industrial reformer of America. And the reason his picture is here rather than some British guy is because he will become important due to the production of iron and steel. So Andrew Carnegie was Scottish, but he was an immigrant and he lived in America, and he started out in the railroad industry and then broke into the steel mill industry after he went to England and met with Henry Bessemer. And by the way, Henry Cort, he invented a process by which iron ore was rolled and hammered. This produced a product called wrought iron. But Andrew Carnegie goes to England and he meets this guy, Sir Henry Bessemer. He created a way to allow steel to be created more inexpensively and efficiently. And again, this process had not been discovered in America. It was only in England. And so he got to be the guy that could bring this new way of producing steel to America, and he can be the American steel guy. And he did so. He took a jump at this plan. Now, what was this method? How was steel able to be created more inexpensively and efficiently? Well, Bessemer found that by shooting a jet of air into the molten iron would help to rid it of more of its impurities. Then, by adding carbon and other metals, he developed steel. With this product, steel production increased tremendously. For example, Britain, Germany, and France and Belgium produced 125,000 tons of steel in 1860. In 1913, they had produced over 32 billion tons. For this reason, the first stage of the Industrial Revolution has been called the Age of Iron. Later, in the later stage, was the Age of Steel. It's amazing because Andrew Carnegie figured out Henry Bessemer's system. He brings it back to America, and he doesn't have a whole lot of money, but he buys a steel mill, and then gets to work. He creates a bridge, and he tries to show America that this new steel product was profitable and inexpensive. And at this point, America hadn't really been using steel. It was too expensive to make. But he showed America that it was safe and it was relatively inexpensive. And Andrew Carnegie became the most important man, arguably, of the Industrial Revolution in America. And by the way, he ended up becoming the most wealthy man in the country at the time because of his commitment to steel. And he felt it was his duty as a wealthy person to give away a lot of his money. So even though he was the richest man in the country, I think, and probably the world, to be honest, but even though he was the wealthiest person in the country and possibly the world, he also understood what the Bible says, when the Bible says it's better to give than to receive. And he gave away huge amounts of his money. In fact, in his entire life, he probably gave away more money than he actually earned. He built Carnegie Hall, the music hall. He built libraries all over the country. He probably gave away more money than he actually kept in his entire life. Now, what did the Industrial Revolution bring by way of transportation? Well, a guy by the name of John McAdams created a way to construct turnpikes, which crushed rocks tightly packed down, allowing for smooth and durable surface to travel on. If you've heard somebody talk about a turnpike, or if you've ever heard anybody say, well, that'll be coming down the pike later on, it's talking about a turnpike. It's basically just a road, but it's a special road. It is a road that is constructed with crushed rocks that are tightly packed down, and that allowed for a smooth and durable surface to travel on. Now, Richard Trevithick, okay, I forgot to write down what he was important for. You do need to know that he built a steam-powered locomotive, and then 10 years later, the locomotive of George Stephenson pulled a train of cars for the first time. So for Richard Trevithick, he created a steam-powered train, and then George Stephenson, his locomotive actually carried cars. So the first guys, his didn't carry anything. Now the final one here, Robert Fulton. He created a steamboat. It was created mostly by steam. Now, transportation. Now we're getting into North Carolina, what's very, very special to us. Wilbur and Orville Wright. They produced the first successful airplane flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But if you'll notice, there was a time where North Carolina's license plates, they only had first in flight. And North Carolina and Ohio has for years fought over the title first in flight because the Wrights were actually from Ohio. They didn't live in North Carolina. They traveled to North Carolina because it was the best place to try their planes. But Ohioans have always said, well, they were from Ohio, so therefore we're the first in flight. To which I would respond, no. They flew it in North Carolina. We are the first in flight. But we finally gave in. The state of North Carolina finally gave in. If you look at a quarter that commemorates the state of Ohio, it now says first in flight. However, if you look at North Carolina's license plates now, and again, some North Carolina license plates still have first in flight in them. Mine, I think, still has first in flight, but I think they're trying to kind of phase those out. Most of the ones you'll find now have first in freedom, and they say that based off of North Carolina was, I believe, the first state to give its Continental Congress representatives the right and the ability to vote for independence. Also, you had the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which was published before the actual Declaration of Independence in 1776. So, First in Flight, First in Freedom. Yeah, I like First in Freedom better, but at the same time, I'm still kind of ticked off that Ohio took First in Flight. You also need to know that Henry Ford, he created the Model T, which is the first type of car that was widely available. Also, while we're talking about Wilbur and Orville Wright, this is how you know. I mean, this is just this is how you know. This happened when when some college was having pledge week, and this was a dare. You can't get into our sorority unless you steal a bust of one of the Wright brothers, and then you gotta hide it somewhere. Well, where are we gonna hide it? Well, let's go to the beach and hide it on the beach. Anyway, okay. Another important aspect of industrialization was mass production. These are all found on page number 451 and 452. What are the four aspects of mass production? You have automation, you had interchangeable parts, you had division of labor, and you had the assembly line. Now, what were some of the consequences? Oh, also Thomas Edison. I forgot about him. Thomas Edison, he is known for having created the light bulb and the phonograph. So the story goes that he had created nearly 1,000 times to create the incandescent light bulb, and nearly 1,000 times he failed. And a newspaperman asked him in a excuse me, in a smart aleck tone. He said, "Mr. Edison, how does it feel to have tried and failed 1,000 times to create a light bulb?" By the way, I think that journalists' relatives are living in 2020. And Edison responded by saying, "I haven't failed 1,000 times, or 10,000 times. I have found out 1,000 or 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb." That's the way you ought to look at stuff. When people criticize you, just say, "Listen, my math is right. I know what I'm doing is right. It might not show up. My fruit might not come in now, but it will eventually. But I just got to stick to what I'm doing." I read a book over Easter break. It's talking about the will of God for your life, and it portrays the will of God as a field, and God has created every man a field that you are to work in. And there are responsibilities you have to do. First off, you have to search for the field. You have to search for God's will for your life. Secondly, you have to consider the field. The Bible talks about the virtuous woman. She considereth the field and buyeth it. You need to consider the field. Is this something that God actually wants me to do with my life, or is this something I want to do with my life? Once you decide it is God's will for your life, what do? Well, then you buy the field. Then you work the field. And then you stay in the field. It does not matter how much you think you fail. If you think that's what God's will for your life is, and you get the advice of more knowledgeable people, because the Bible says, "In the multitude of counselors is wisdom." If you're getting wisdom from other people, and you believe this is God's will for you, then you stick to that. Don't leave the field. Thomas Edison, wouldn't it have stunk if he had said, "I'm going to leave this field. I'm going to stop doing this," and we'd be sitting in darkness, or at the very least by a candlelight. I'm thankful he didn't give up. Now, while we wrap up, evaluate the industrial age. Some today see nothing but evil in the Industrial Revolution. They condemn capitalism, which made possible the industrial growth for providing the poor living and working conditions. They blame the free enterprise system for allowing a few to get rich while many remained poor, but this view overlooks the fact that conditions in the rural areas were no better than those in the crowded cities. Farm workers had to work as long as under many adverse conditions as did the factory workers. Also, it must be remembered that industrialism provided jobs for the increasing number of unemployed farm workers. I will not deny that the industrial age saw some crooked folks. I'm not going to deny that there wasn't steps that needed to be taken to fix stuff. I'm not going to say that wasn't That's not the case. What I am going to say is that we got better. Folks, you're going to go out into this world and you're going to have leftists, people that are against capitalism, against the free enterprise system. And you know what they're going to say? They're going to say capitalism is the evil, the great Satan. It's going to be the thing that eventually leads us to ruin. It's going to be the thing that results in the destruction of the American economy, even though capitalism is the single greatest force to pull people up by their bootstraps humanity has ever seen. Listen, not everybody in the industrial age they're not all angels. But at the same time, we have gotten better. The reason 12-year-olds aren't working in factories now like they were in the Industrial Revolution is because we as human beings got better. And we as human beings changed our expectations, except for China. They're still putting 12-year-olds in factories. But that's not racist. But the world has, by and large, changed things. The civilized world says, listen, children cannot be exploited. And you can be told, if you think your company's not paying you enough, you have the power to vote with your boots. You get to vote by walking out of that boardroom, out of that manager's office, and say, okay, you don't think I'm worth it? Why don't I go across the street to whatever companies across the street, offer my services to them and see if they won't offer me more money for what I bring to the table. That's a great thing about capitalism. That's a great thing about the free enterprise system. It is a distortion to say that no one was concerned about the conditions in which these workers lived and worked. The moral and social consciences of the Victorian age initiated many reforms. On the other hand, some were too enthusiastic about the growth of industrialism. While the Industrial Revolution created new opportunities and provided a greater abundance for more people, it also led to a growing emphasis upon material goods and a decrease in spiritual concern. People tend to forget God when they seek material gain. The Apostle Paul warns against false teachers that promote the idea that gain is godliness, from which he says we should withdraw ourselves. We must remember that the problems in any society, both individual and collective, are the result of sin. In the industrial age, as in many other, greed and cruelty, or in the industrial age, as in any other, greed and cruelty, discontent and immorality were to blame for the poor conditions. It wasn't capitalism. It wasn't the free enterprise system. It wasn't the free market economy. It was sin, plain and simple. All right, we're gonna go ahead and call that a day. Make sure you're keeping up with your work. Also remember, if you haven't so far, you need to go online with your parents. Show them your grades on iNow. That is a quiz grade I believe I've made it a quiz grade for you. A grade you need to have them look at this. I'm not with you every day, so I can't get in touch with you and say, hey, you know what? You're missing this, you're missing that. You failed this. You just barely passed that. I can't do that. Get in touch with your parents. Have your parents get online with you. And then have them call me, or you can get in touch with me over Google Classroom, and we'll get to work on this, guys. We can beat this gang. I just want you guys to know that I love you, and I'm always praying for you.